All right, welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today's topic, 4.1, is technological innovations between the era circa 1450 and circa 1750. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and look at essential question for this topic. So this essential question is basically putting the AP learning objective into a question form. And basically your gauge of are you prepared after studying this lesson would be if you can answer this question basically in like an essay form, providing details and examples and basically a thesis out of it. So the essential question is, how did cross-cultural interactions spread technology and facilitate changes in trade and travel from 1450 to 1750? So this is an extremely important year. In many college courses and things, they actually divide up usually the course between what they would call like pre-modern history and modern history, usually right at the beginning of this time period, 1450, specifically because of the beginning of the age of exploration, of European exploration. So this is an important part of what a lot of people just separate as kind of modern and pre-modern history. So with that, what we're going to do today with topic 4.1 is basically bring about how was this age of exploration able to even happen, right? And it comes down to new technological innovations that allowed these explorations to happen. And of course, the giant domino effect that happened specifically when Europeans started hitting the seas with global trade networks being created, exploration of new continents, colonization, conquest, so many different ripple effects. So we're basically going to set the stage as how was it even possible that we had people like Christopher Columbus or Vasco da Gama? What made that even possible? And it started with technological innovation. So that is what we are going to do. So let's go ahead and start here. Let's set the stage up a little bit. So new innovations allowed Europeans to venture long distances on the ocean. And this is something, again, brand new because Europeans had not necessarily done that. Now, Europeans have very much navigated the Mediterranean and maybe some of the North Atlantic, but Europeans had never ventured along, say, the western coast of Africa to really any extent. No Europeans have sailed around Africa. And, of course, up to this point, other than a small handful of Viking expeditions, which, touched more of North America, we did not have long-term colonization of other continents. So that's going to be a big thing, and we're going to look at what innovations allowed that to be possible. Now, just a couple of things to introduce that you're going to learn about here that you're going to want to pay careful attention to is some of those specific innovations that allowed that. So one, the magnetic compass that came out of China, of course, helped ships keep direction and go potentially the right direction. Kind of interesting, by the way, the magnetic compass, from what I've learned, was originally started as almost like a fortune-telling device till they understood a little bit more about what was actually happening and that you could get a directional heading from it. So interesting side note there. The astrolabe. This was a technology came out of the Islamic trading world that basically determined latitude. So using some angles of measuring some different angles astronomically and things like that, they were able to determine how far north or south you were, which of course was very important. And of course, these happen at different levels. So like magnetic compass, when that came in, that's going to make certain things obsolete and stuff like that. And then also some new ships and shipping technology, both with larger ships with larger hulls, like the caravel ship, which really becomes a standard ship for Europeans that traveled. It was a stronger ship and specifically was able to navigate through storms better, which boats, a lot of especially European boats before this, couldn't handle that very well. And then we saw big advances and improvement in cartography or map making. That was a huge deal. And then added on to that would be new knowledge of climate patterns, wind patterns specifically. Some of the biggest ones were the winds over the Indian Ocean, which have basically a methodical pattern that, if you do it right, can help guide you. But that'll be more. We've talked about that before in this course, but that's something you're going to want to know. The trade winds, or the winds of the Indian Ocean. Okay, so just finishing up setting the stage here. One thing would be, why are Europeans doing this? One is population outlet. Europe is growing in its population, and with its pretty stifling social structure, there wasn't a lot of upward mobility possible for people to get new jobs and even nobility to be able to expand. So as populations in Europe grew, people needed more opportunities to find jobs and food, right? Even again, that's wasn't even just the lower classes. We're talking upper classes. A topic that has been, or in previous topics, that impacted this was primogeniture laws. So in many places in Europe, basically the land that would be passed down through generations was usually just those estates usually just given to the eldest son, which meant if you were not the eldest son and you were a noble, you're not going to inherit land. You're going to have to find another way to do that. So you get a lot of these nobles that were also part of this, and of course they have money, which they can use, of course, to use on these explorations. Okay, and then also the religious element. This, especially because this age of exploration era also ties into the Protestant Reformation, you see a lot more religious diversity in Europe. So you'll get groups that want to move around to different areas. Some of them because they're religious minorities and want to have religious freedoms, like, say, the Puritans going to the Americas. And then also proselytizing, right? Finding new places to spread religions, both Protestant and Catholic, coming out of there. All right. Now, there's kind of this stereotype in a way that during the Middle Ages, Europe was just totally isolated from the rest of the world, and that's just not true. I mean, maybe there's not as much direct connection, but it definitely happens, and this had been done continually through the Islamic world. The Islamic Middle Eastern world was really the facilitators of trade and connections from east to west, because they are in control of the central, Silk Road routes that connect Asia to Europe, and then also the Indian Ocean trade routes are dominated by Muslim traders. So that is basically how Europe had interacted with that, getting the luxury goods such as silk and spices and tea. This was coming eventually into the Mediterranean. What you started to see in the 1500s, though, was Europeans become far more active in the Indian Ocean, as some of the first voyages by Europeans around Africa into the Indian Ocean started to come in. And again, hopefully trying to find wealth, and that should say converts, I'm sorry there, but wealth through access to trade routes and converts. Now, one thing that is definitely, I didn't write here, but has been talked about a lot and in other topics was, why all of a sudden, too, did Europeans need to find other ways to get more direct access to Asia? Now, remember, in the 1450s, Constantinople fell, which was basically at the crossroads of the Silk Road and Europe's access to the east. And when Constantinople fell, there definitely was a hostility between the groups, the Byzantine Empire falling and now the Ottoman Empire taking that region, and some of that direct access was blocked. So one of the reasons, too, why Europeans are hitting the seas, too, is to find ways to try to get direct access to Asia, because their land routes are now not nearly as safe and usable as they could have been. So trying to find new routes, whether it's going south around Africa, which again no Europeans had ever done before, or in Columbus's case is try to go west. But the European traders did try to establish like Middle Eastern trade routes. For example, the Omani-European rivalry. The Portuguese, for example, were trying to set up ports in what today would be Oman, down there and in the Middle East, to get access to the Indian Ocean. And the Islamic traders were, of course, having none of that. So it was deeply competitive. And again, one of the reasons why Europeans eventually are going to try to either sail west to go around the earth that way, or south, was because that Middle Eastern area is basically already in control by other groups, specifically those Islamic groups. So trying to find another way to try to actually take that over. Okay. So the individual explorers and some of their effects are going to be talked about later. But just to introduce a few things, it's going to be especially later in this unit. So we're not going to get into too much of the specific explorers, because today what we're doing is really just trying to talk about what made these explorations and stuff possible. Okay, so just to kind of set it up, the voyages of Columbus connected people across the Atlantic Ocean, a connection that had really never existed before. I mean, to much of Europe, the Americas don't even exist. And we'll talk more about Columbus, too, about why he thought that. I mean, just in general why he thought you could go sail west was his big thing, and just to I guess foreshadow a little bit, was Columbus thought the Earth was a lot smaller than everybody thought. He basically thought all the cartographers were small, and that you didn't really have to sail all that far west to get there. But of course, find there's going to be another continent, and that's going to change, the planet. But having the first time in the world direct contact between the Atlantic Ocean, so a few things that were connected. From the Americas, obtaining sugar, tobacco, and rum. From Africa, slaves, of course. And then from Asia, obtaining more of those luxury goods, right? Silk, spices, and rhubarb. And what this explosion of trade, by the way, is really going to create is what we call maritime empires. So these are empires in the classical sense, but they're maritime, meaning they're not connected. They are connected through sea travel. So you have your empire's colonies dotted all around the ocean world. And the European nations that participated in this, the big ones were Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, France, and Holland, or the Dutch there, will develop maritime empires. So again, it's not a largely physically connected empire like the Mongol Empire was for its time, or Rome, but maritime empires dotting all around the world. Okay. By the way, as far as kind of gender and gender roles, and with this kind of era of exploration and global trade, most trade was conducted by men across the world. But interestingly, in Southeast Asia, women actually played often the biggest role in trade, as they were the ones often doing trade in the marketplace. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what were some of the technologies and things. So Europeans had been working with some ancient sailing technologies that go back to ancient Greece, to Rome, and more the ancient Islamic and Asian world, right? But a lot of those technologies, they were good, but didn't necessarily allow the Europeans to do the far-reaching trade and exploration. We'll talk about that. Now, something very important to understand is there's a big domino effect, in a way, of this exploration. It almost turns into a race in a way, but was really started by this guy right here, Prince Henry the Navigator, this noble from Portugal. And he was a leading figure because he was a wealthy man, and his sailing efforts, though, never really were groundbreaking in a way. For example, usually European sailors, and to be honest, most sailors around the world, don't rarely actually get far enough away from the coast where you can't see it, because navigational techniques were, again, in such an infancy that you could easily get lost if you could not sight land. So people usually did not get sight of land. But where he was important, so that wasn't necessarily an invasion. Like, he's going to these, open seas is called. But what he did was finance these expeditions further along the Western African coast than any European had ever done. And what the Portuguese were also doing was setting up trading posts along Western Africa. Now, these posts and this influence of the Portuguese never got very far inland. They didn't have the military power to go real deep there into Africa, but setting up trade posts all along Western Africa. And it was through the Portuguese in this early years that they eventually pretty much explored and dotted the entire Western African coast. The Portuguese Bartolomeu Diaz, who's not on here, but Bartolomeu Diaz was the first European to sail to the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. So the Portuguese are the ones that set off the age of exploration directly. And with their success, of course, is going to come other nations trying to get that on. Later on, we'll learn about Vasco da Gama, the first European to sail to Asia, who sailed all the way around Africa into the Indian Ocean and made contact with India. So the Portuguese kind of were the first to sort of start this. So we're going to talk about two different categories of advances that came. One in ideas and one in specific technologies. So one of the things going on here is scientific revolution, right? Sir Isaac Newton's work on gravity also helped with navigation, specifically when discovery of gravitational concepts came to be more kind of formalized and finalized. They understood how gravitation played an effect on tides, right? Between the moon and the earth, tides. And this was important for sailors so they could have a predictability of when tides come in. because a lot of them didn't want to go necessarily like a low tide or something, but a higher tide would be better, especially because the detection of rocks. If you're able to go at what would be going to be a higher tide, you may have a better chance of sea levels not being lower, so you would go into rocks, which was always the big enemy of travelers. Because again, they don't want to go often too far away from the coast, and one of the great things that would happen is crashing into rocks, off the coast. So interesting how you get this scientific discovery like gravitation and actually how it helped navigation. Another big improvement was more and more accurate astronomical charts. Now, astronomical charts are basically maps of stars and galaxies, and this had always been a useful thing because when you're out in the dark and in more open water types places, the only thing you really have to navigate is star charts. So sailors have been using these, of course, for millennia. They relied on them, especially specifically to give the ships direction, and especially before the compass came over in Europe, to Europe when magnetic compass comes over. But we have star charts, astronomical charts that were used by astronomers and navigators from ancient Babylon. We have them clear back to them, and just Mesopotamian cultures in general. Chinese, Greek astronomers, they use these charts. They were working on those, but we started seeing as more accurate ones. All right, then equipment. This is kind of the big one, and what I'm going to be throwing out at you guys is a whole bunch of specific inventions and things that you definitely want to know because they are very, very citable as evidence for essays and things like that, which is often coming up in this course. So one is the improved rudder, which we've actually talked about already, but improved form of a rudder, which is basically a steering kind of device that actually came over from China. So it was invented in China and then imported eventually to more of the West there. Now, as far as directional things, one of the big kind of early outbreak or whatever introduction was the astrolabe, and I'll show you some pictures of these things in a second. But this was basically made and improved by Muslim scholars and Muslim sailors, and through measuring some different angles with I think the horizon and the sky. I forget exactly how it works, but you're able to roughly determine how far north or south you are. Basically your equator, which like you imagine would be really important. Now the magnetic compass really became the most probably important navigational device, and that came out of China and became again the primary direction finding device. So when that comes over into the Islamic world and into the European world, that was a huge step forward for navigation, especially when going out into open seas, when you want to try to cut corners and try to find the straightest line of travel, and allows you to get away from the coast so you can actually and be able to still navigate that way. And then another big innovation was the sails. So the Arab world had been using these triangular sails, the lateen sail, and these were great because they're better. They end up being better than the square sails. Square sails require and can really only use one direction of wind pattern, which means it's nearly impossible, to go in a crosswinds. A lateen sail, and I'll show you, is a triangular sail. And what this was able to do was catch winds from different directions. So once they kind of started understanding that, you see this start to come up in the West. And sometimes you'll see ships that have both kind of sails. Because I guess if you do have the wind on you, maybe that square sail could be really good. But if you don't have the wind exactly in the pattern you need, the lateen sail is the one you want to use. So on the left would be an astrolabe. So again, you measure these angles, you hold it up, I think, and you basically get this kind of line of latitude. Looking more into it about how it specifically works, if you're more interested in that. And then the middle there, just some early compasses. Even the earlier compasses than this looked far more primitive, but this would be like an example of a magnetic compass coming out of China. And again, I had heard that the compass was originally invented to almost be like a fortune telling device, because I don't know if they really understood the properties of like why it was going north and whole the magnetic attraction coming out of the North Pole. But once I guess they kind of figured out that it was like this fixed position going north, I don't think it took that much kind of thought after that of being, hey, this could be really used well for navigation. But then the lateen sail on the right here, so it's a triangular sail that again is better if you have crosswinds. So the wind patterns, if they weren't exactly, I guess, the way going for you, you could still manage to navigate. And there's also discussion that Latin sail may have come from Rome as well, but really expanded on the Islamic world as they started going across the Indian Ocean that way. Okay. Other things and equipment were new ships. So you started to see larger, safer ships coming out there. So three examples. One's the Carrack, which was a very large one, 150 feet long. That was developed by Portugal. The most famous and I think widely used one, though, was the Caravel, which was 75 feet long. And that was developed both by the Portuguese and the Spanish. And then also it was called the Flute. If I pronounce that right, it's Dutch. That was an 80-foot long boat that the Dutch used as well. So let me show you here on the next page. So on the top left, you have a Carrack. So that's a Carrack. Looks like a classic pirate ship almost, doesn't it, up there? In the top right is a Caravel. And this is the one that you really saw most common, and I think most used, was the Caravel there in the upper right. And then down below, the one down below is the Dutch Flute. So those are just some ships. So you see a lot of similarities with them. Like you can see the mix of sails, right? So like in all of them, you can see a square sail and a lateen sail. So again, I guess if you can use the square sail, which has maybe more surface area, you can do that. But again, if you have some crosswinds, the square sail doesn't do well with those. So that's when you definitely you want to use the lateen sail. So having different options and not letting the wind patterns completely dictate if you're going to be successful or not. All right, and then let's look at the long-term results here. Now, obviously, these technologies led to a rapid expansion of exploration and global trade that would not have been possible before this. These technological and just knowledge innovations made this age of exploration that's about to begin possible. Now, one of the other things was, okay, these are some great naval innovations, but also, how do you compete, right? Europeans, for example, if they want a piece of Asia, they're going up against massive empires, strong military empires, right? You got the Mughal Empire in Asia, which was wealthier than probably all the European kingdoms combined. You got like the Ming Dynasty in the east, and these other different kingdoms all over the place. Now, gunpowder has now made its way over to Europe. And innovating the use of gunpowder into these naval expeditions allowed them to be more forceful in that, where they can basically force their way into trade relationships by threatening to, say, siege a port city. Or if you are competing with other ships, you could attack other ships. And, of course, what happened, too, was piracy. As pirates were able to gain access to gunpowder, they were able to sail out in these trade routes and use this military arms to be able to fight off and either steal from other traders or hijack them or something like that. So gunpowder is really the final thing that made the Europeans able to have really any kind of forceful presence in, say, India or Southeast Asia, because they could show up with ships, and again, if the trade relationship wasn't what they liked, then they could be more forceful with that. Some other long-term results, of course, is the spread of religions. Now, we've talked already about how in Europeans, we're also using some of these trade networks as ways to spread Catholicism or Protestantism. So you started to see like Christianity spread to different parts of the world. And then the Islamic world. We've already talked about this because this was going back into before this time period. Islam spread greatly into Southeast Asia and into sub-Saharan Africa through Muslim merchants. So religion spread with these new technologies and different products there. But yeah, these new technologies just spread all over the place. I mean, some of them not even necessarily full naval powers. We've talked earlier in it's about Peter the Great of Russia, who wanted to westernize Russia. He spent time in Western Europe and saw these naval and military innovations that were starting to happen in Europe and were being used. And he brought those over to Russia to create like a westernized nation that way. So these technologies are spreading all over because it's not very hard to see how successful they actually are. And that will basically do it today. Let's go ahead and revisit the essential question. So the essential question was, how did cross-cultural interactions spread technology and facilitate changes and trade and travel, from 1450 to 1750. So after having studied this lesson, reading your book, doing your activities in class or on your own, hearing from the lesson and just hearing some more, you should be able to answer this question with evidence and be able to explain how these technologies, again, help facilitate this trade. These changes in trade would not have been possible without these technologies. Can you cite evidence? Can you talk about innovations in the actual ships, the navigational innovations that came in, the knowledge, cartography, right? Understanding of tides, wind patterns. Can you be able to explain those in detail? Okay, if you do that, you've met your objective. Okay, so that is your goal for this lesson as you're studying on your own, in class, and whatever it is. Okay, with that then, we're going to go ahead and cut it here and go ahead and let you get back to your studies, right? So make sure you're taking your education into your own hands. Don't expect somebody to do it for you. If you have questions or you need help, seek it. Use your resources. Use your texts. Use each other. Use your classmates. Use your teacher. Right? Own your education. Okay? All of this, you can do this, you can understand this stuff, and you can succeed. Okay? As long as you understand that you are in the driver's seat of it. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and end it here. Keep studying. You can do it. We'll see you next time.